Snow whipped against the frosted windows of the Silver Pines saloon, but the chill inside was far more biting. Cordelia Hastings stood in the center of the room, her threadbare dress trembling as the seventh man turned his back on her. Laughter echoed from the corners, thick with cruelty and cheap whiskey. She had offered her hand, her pride, and her life, only to be cast aside like rusted tin. But as the final sneer left the deputy's lips, the heavy oak doors splintered open. The wind howled, and in stepped a shadow of a man, bringing the true storm with him. The winter of 1878 descended upon the settlement of Dead Man's Gulch, Colorado, with a merciless ferocity. It was a town carved out of granite and greed, populated by miners who chased veins of silver deep into the earth and merchants who mined the miners' pockets. In this unforgiving landscape, a good name was currency. Cordelia Hastings possessed neither currency nor a good name. At 22, Cordelia carried a burden that would have broken men twice her age. Her father, Jeremiah Hastings, had once been the town's most trusted assayer, but a sickness of the mind and a weakness for the bottle had driven him to a catastrophic mistake. 6 months prior, in a haze of rye whiskey and desperation, Jeremiah had gambled away the land deeds of 4 local families to a ruthless Denver syndicate. When the magnitude of his betrayal settled upon him, Jeremiah walked into the tree line with his Colt revolver and never walked back. He left behind a town boiling with vengeance, a staggering debt of $2,000, and his 3 children, Cordelia and the 8-year-old twins, Ben and Lily. The bank had already seized their livestock. The mercantile had cut off their credit. Now, with the first blizzards sealing the mountain passes, the bank manager had issued a final ultimatum. The Hastings cabin would be repossessed by the week's end. Cordelia and the twins would be cast out into the sub-zero elements. There was only one harsh transactional survival mechanism left for a destitute woman in the West: marriage. If a man took her as his wife, he would assume her debts, but he would also acquire her father's remaining pristine acreage near the riverland. The town didn't know, held pure untapped freshwater springs. Cordelia packed away her grief, washed her only decent calico dress, and set out to sell her future. Her first stop was the grand, timber-framed house of Josiah Trent, the son of the town's wealthiest investor. Josiah was a man of fine suits and soft hands, who had once spent a summer courting Cordelia with wildflowers and poetry before her father's disgrace. She stood in his opulent parlor, the scent of expensive beeswax candles mocking the damp wool of her shawl. "Josiah," Cordelia had said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You know my situation. I am a hard worker. I will keep your house. I will be a dutiful wife, and the river acreage will belong to you. I only ask that you shelter my brother and sister." Josiah had poured himself a glass of amber sherry, not bothering to offer her one. He looked at her not with the affection of a former suitor, but with the cold calculation of a pawnbroker. "Cordelia, you are a beautiful woman, but the Hastings name is a rotting carcass. If I marry you, my investors in Denver will think I lack judgment. Why would I buy a stolen horse, even if it has a pretty mane?" He had laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "I can offer you a position as a scullery maid, perhaps. But a ring? You overreach." Swallowing the bile in her throat, Cordelia left the Trent house and walked through the freezing mud to the parish. Reverend Thomas Alcott was a man who preached charity every Sunday from his pine pulpit. He was recently widowed and in need of a mother for his unruly brood of boys. Cordelia found him in the vestry, sorting through tithing coins. She made her desperate plea, wrapping it in the language of duty and Christian charity. The Reverend listened, his face a mask of pious sorrow. "My dear Cordelia," Reverend Alcott sighed, folding his hands over his slightly paunched stomach. "The Lord commands us to forgive, but he also commands us to be wise stewards of our flock. The sins of the father are a heavy shadow. My congregation would never accept the daughter of a thief and a coward as the moral compass of the parsonage. Your lineage is tainted by deceit. I will pray for your soul, but I cannot invite your ruin into my home." 2 rejections. 2 men who had once smiled at her, now shrinking away from the invisible leprosy of poverty and scandal. Cordelia walked back to her freezing cabin that night, her boots numb, her heart hardening into something resembling quartz. She stoked the dying embers in the hearth, watched Ben and Lily shiver beneath a single wool blanket, and knew she could not stop. She would swallow every ounce of her pride if it meant keeping them alive. By Friday, the town was preparing for the winter solstice gathering at the Silver Pine Saloon, a massive, rowdy affair where the town's business was conducted. Debts were settled, and liquor flowed to stave off the winter madness. The saloon, a cavernous wooden structure smelling of stale beer and chewing tobacco, was packed to the rafters. Mayor Higgins had instituted a debt court for the evening, an archaic local tradition where debtors could publicly auction their labor, property, or in desperate cases themselves, to satisfy their creditors. Cordelia had no property left but the barren acreage. She had no labor that could generate $2,000. She had only herself. She walked into the saloon, the heavy doors shutting behind her, sealing her inside a room filled with the very people her father had wronged. The piano player faltered, the plinking notes dying out. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the room as eyes turned toward her. Women whispered behind lace fans. Men leaned against the mahogany bar, their expressions ranging from pity to outright contempt. Cordelia stepped forward, her chin held high, though her insides felt like crushed glass. She approached the mayor's platform. "I am here to settle the Hastings debt," she announced, her voice piercing the smoky air. "I offer my hand in marriage, my absolute loyalty, and the deed to the river property to any man willing to assume the bank's note and shelter my siblings." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not a private rejection. This was a public gauntlet. She turned first to Ezra Cobb, the town blacksmith. He was a widower, broad, shouldered, and practical. "Mr. Cobb," she said evenly, "you have said you need help with the accounts and the homestead." Ezra wiped his soot-stained hands on a rag, looking uncomfortably at the floor. "You're a proud woman, Miss Hastings. Too proud. I need a woman who knows her place, not one carrying the arrogance of a fallen assayer. And I won't have my neighbors spitting on my porch because of who I married. No." 3. She pivoted to Nathaniel Briggs, a cattle rancher who owned the largest spread on the plateau. "Mr. Briggs, the river acreage borders your north pasture. It would grant you vital water access." Nathaniel spat a stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon, wiping his mouth with the back of a leather-gloved hand. "I need a wife to breed strong sons." Cordelia. Not a charity case carrying a curse. Everything your daddy touched withered and died. "I won't risk my herd on your family's bad luck." No. 4. The crowd's whispers grew louder, barbed with cruel amusement. Cordelia felt the heat rising in her cheeks, but she forced her legs to carry her to the poker tables. Samuel Weston, a professional gambler with a silver-tipped cane and a reputation for ruthlessness, was shuffling a deck of cards. "Mr. Weston," she began. Sam didn't even look up from his cards. "I don't buy losing hands, sweetheart." "But," he smirked, finally meeting her eyes with a predatory glint, "if you want to come up to my room later and work off a few dollars of that debt without the ring, my door is open." A few men chuckled. Cordelia's jaw tightened so hard her teeth ached. 5. Desperation clawing at her throat, she looked toward the edge of the room. Henry Foster, the timid schoolteacher who had often praised her intelligence and lent her books, stood near the stove. She walked toward him. "Henry, please." Henry turned crimson, his eyes darting around the room, terrified of the town's judgment. I make barely enough to feed myself, Cordelia. And the school board, they would dismiss me. I'm sorry. I cannot." He physically stepped away from her, as if proximity would infect him. 6. Cordelia stood alone in the center of the saloon. The floorboards seemed to sway beneath her feet. She had one last option: William Dalton, the sheriff's deputy. He was a brash, arrogant man who had tried to corner her at barn dances for years, always seeking liberties she had firmly denied. Surely, for the price of ownership, he would step forward. "Deputy Dalton," she said, her voice finally beginning to crack, "you have made your interests known in the past. Will you take my hand?" William Dalton leaned back against the bar, hooking his thumbs into his gun belt. He looked her up and down, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He let the silence stretch, ensuring every soul in the saloon was watching. "Well now, Miss Hastings," Dalton drawled loudly. "There was a time I might have paid a high price for a night with you, but by the cow when the whole herd is diseased, your father was a cheat. Your blood is poison. And frankly, watching the high and mighty Cordelia Hastings beg like a stray dog is worth more to me than that useless strip of river mud." The saloon erupted into harsh, jagged laughter. 7. Cordelia closed her eyes. The seventh rejection was the killing blow. The sound of the laughter was a physical weight, pressing her down into the sawdust-covered floor. She had failed. She would return to the cabin, pack what little they had, and lead Ben and Lily into the freezing wilderness to die. There was no salvation in Dead Man's Gulch. Just as Mayor Higgins raised his gavel to dismiss the spectacle and finalize the bank's foreclosure, a violent gust of wind slammed against the saloon. The heavy double doors were violently kicked open, the iron hinges shrieking in protest. The laughter died instantly. The piano player froze. A swirling vortex of white snow blew into the room, and out of the blizzard stepped a nightmare made flesh. It was Gideon Hayes. The town knew him only as the Mountain Ghost, a solitary trapper who lived high up in the jagged peaks of the San Juan Range, far beyond the timberline where sensible men refused to tread. He came into town perhaps twice a year, spoke to no one, traded massive pelts and raw gold for gunpowder and salt, and vanished back into the ice. Rumors trailed him like wolves, that he was an outlaw running from the army, that he had survived an avalanche by eating his horse, that he had killed a fully grown grizzly bear with a jagged piece of flint. Gideon was a towering monolith of a man, standing easily over 6'3". He was draped in a massive, frost-covered bear hide, the thick fur making him look twice as broad. Beneath the pelt, he wore buckskin and heavy canvas, weather-beaten and scarred. A long, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, but his eyes, a piercing, icy silver, burned beneath the brim of a battered Stetson. Slung across his broad back was a heavy Sharps buffalo rifle, and a wicked-looking Bowie knife rested at his hip. He kicked the doors shut behind him with a boot the size of an anvil. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot in the dead, silent saloon. Every man in the room instinctively shrank back. Deputy Dalton's hand hovered nervously near his revolver, but he didn't dare draw it. The wealthy women who had moments before been mocking Cordelia now sat frozen, terrified by the sheer, primal violence radiating from the man. Gideon didn't look at the mayor. He didn't look at the deputy, or the banker, or the gambler. His silver eyes swept the room and locked instantly, unyieldingly, onto Cordelia. She stood frozen in the center of the sawdust floor, her face pale, her breath catching in her throat as the giant began to move. His heavy boots thudded against the floorboards, each step deliberate and heavy. He walked right past Josiah Trent, who shrank into the shadows. He walked past Nathaniel Briggs, brushing the rancher aside with a massive shoulder as if Briggs were nothing more than a dry cornstalk. He stopped mere inches from Cordelia. Up close, he smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and cold iron. Cordelia tilted her head back to look at him. She expected violence. She expected him to push her aside to reach the bar. Instead, he simply looked down at her. The intensity in his eyes was not pity, nor was it the cruel mockery of the townsfolk. It was something fierce, possessive, and terrifyingly deep. Without a word, Gideon reached a massive, leather-gloved hand into the deep pockets of his bear-hide coat. He pulled out a heavy canvas sack. He didn't hand it to the mayor. He didn't hand it to the banker. He dropped it directly at Cordelia's worn leather boots. The sack hit the floorboards with a dense, metallic thud that shook the nearest tables. The leather string tying it came loose, and a cascade of raw, unrefined gold nuggets spilled out onto the sawdust. There was easily $4,000 worth of gold resting on the floor. The town collectively gasped. Mayor Higgins nearly dropped his gavel. "My God," someone whispered. Gideon finally spoke. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, like boulders shifting during a rock slide. He didn't address the room. He spoke only to Cordelia. "The debt is paid," Gideon said. Josiah Trent stepped forward from the crowd, his greed temporarily overriding his fear. "Now see here, Hayes. That's a noble gesture. But paying the debt doesn't secure the river property." The terms of the auction clearly state that a man must take the girl as his wife to acquire the deeds. And she is. Gideon didn't even turn his head. He moved with terrifying speed, his massive hand shooting out to grab the front of Josiah's expensive wool suit. With a single, effortless heave, Gideon lifted the wealthy investor completely off the ground. Josiah gasped, his legs kicking in the air, his face turning purple. "I didn't ask about the property," Gideon growled, his voice vibrating through the rafters. He tossed Josiah aside like a rag doll. Josiah crashed into a poker table, splintering the wood and sending cards flying. Gideon turned his attention back to Cordelia. He reached out, his massive, scarred fingers gently, almost reverently brushing a stray lock of hair away from her freezing cheek. The contrast between the sheer violence of his presence and the incredible gentleness of his touch sent a shockwave through Cordelia's chest. "I claim the woman," Gideon stated, his voice carrying absolute, undeniable finality. He looked into Cordelia's wide, stunned eyes. "You are done asking these cowards for your life. Get your coat, Cordelia. We're going to get your siblings." The walk from the Silver Pine Saloon to the dilapidated Hastings cabin was a silent, surreal march. The blizzard had intensified, but Cordelia felt no cold. Her mind was a fractured mirror, reflecting the sheer impossibility of the last hour. Behind her, the heavy, rhythmic crunch of Gideon Hayes's boots in the snow was a terrifying reminder of her new reality. She belonged to the mountain ghost. She had sold her life to a man the town whispered was a savage, a murderer, a beast who thrived where civilized men perished. When they reached the sagging porch of the cabin, Cordelia turned, her hand resting on the frozen iron latch. She looked up at the towering silhouette of the man before her. The snow clung to his thick beard, and the massive bear hide draped over his shoulders. "My brother and sister are inside," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They are young. They are frightened. I beg of you, Mr. Hayes, whatever your intentions are with me, do not let them see my fear. Do not be cruel to them." Gideon stared down at her, the icy silver of his eyes catching the faint, pale light of the moon bleeding through the storm clouds. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling wind. Then, he reached out and gently pushed the door open. "I did not buy you to be cruel, Cordelia," he rumbled, his voice startlingly calm. "And I did not buy you to be a slave. I paid a debt. Now, get the children." Inside, the hearth was completely dead. Ben and Lily were huddled together beneath a thin quilt on the floor, their lips blue, shivering violently. When the massive, fur-clad giant stepped into the room behind their sister, Lily let out a terrified whimper and buried her face in Ben's chest. Ben, though only 8, reached for a rusted fire poker, trying to stand between the intruder and his sister. Gideon did not advance. He stopped just inside the doorway, slowly unslung his heavy Sharps rifle, and leaned it against the wall. He then unbuckled his thick canvas pack. From it, he pulled 2 massive, incredibly thick blankets made of cured wolf pelt and woven wool. He tossed them to Cordelia. "Wrap them," he instructed quietly. "Double the layers. We have a 5-mile climb before the trail narrows." Cordelia scrambled to bundle the twins, her hands shaking as she tied the heavy pelts around their small frames. She packed a single satchel with their mother's Bible, a tintype photograph of their family before the ruin, and what little winter clothing they had left. When she turned back, Gideon was waiting. "They cannot walk 5 miles in this snow," Cordelia pleaded, looking at the snowdrifts piling up outside the window. "The drifts are past their waists. They will freeze." Without a word, Gideon, "No!" He picked up Lily, who gasped in fear, and tucked her securely into the crook of his left arm, wrapping the excess bear hide of his own coat around her. He then reached out and hoisted Ben onto his broad right shoulder, securing the boy with a massive hand. He stood, effortlessly carrying the combined weight of the children, plus his gear, as if they were made of dried kindling. "Walk in my footsteps," Gideon told Cordelia. "Do not stop. If you lose sight of my back, you will die." The ascent into the San Juan Mountains was a grueling, agonizing test of endurance. The trail was practically invisible, a sheer, treacherous, winding path carved into the granite spine of the peaks. Cordelia forced her legs to move, stepping exactly where Gideon's massive boots had compacted the snow. The wind screamed through the canyons, biting at her exposed cheeks like shattered glass, but Gideon broke the brunt of the gale. He moved with a relentless, mechanical rhythm, a creature perfectly adapted to the hostility of the high timberline. For 3 hours they climbed, the air growing thinner, colder, and more suffocating. Just as Cordelia's vision began to blur at the edges, and her frozen legs threatened to give out completely, a shape materialized through the swirling white darkness. It was not a crude shack or a cave, as the town legends had claimed. It was a fortress. Built directly into the lee of a massive granite overhang, Gideon's cabin was a masterpiece of survival engineering. Thick, interlocking logs of Douglas fir formed the walls, chinked tightly with clay and moss, completely impervious to the wind. A heavy stone chimney billowed thick, fragrant wood smoke into the night sky. Gideon kicked the heavy timber door open and ushered them inside. The blast of heat that hit Cordelia's face was so intense it brought immediate tears to her eyes. The interior was expansive and meticulously organized. Cast iron skillets hung from ceiling beams. A massive river stone hearth dominated the far wall, roaring with a fire that had clearly been banked to burn for days. Books, hundreds of them, leather-bound and worn-lined shelves carved directly into the rock face. Gideon set the children down gently on a braided rug near the fire. He stripped off his frost-covered gloves and coat. Underneath, he wore a clean, woven canvas shirt that stretched tight across his muscular shoulders. He looked at Cordelia, who stood shivering by the door, completely overwhelmed. "Take off your wet boots," he ordered softly, moving toward a cast-iron stove in the corner where a kettle was already beginning to whistle. "There is dried meat and hardtack in the pantry. Tea is steeping. When the children are warm, there is a second room behind the curtain. The bed is yours." Cordelia stared at him, bewildered. And where will you sleep?" Gideon pulled a thick wool blanket from a chest and threw it onto the floorboards near the door. "Here. To keep the fire stoked." He paused, looking at her with those intense silver eyes. "No harm will come to you in this house, Cordelia. You have my word on that." Down in the valley, the atmosphere in the Silver Pine Saloon had shifted from stunned silence to venomous greed. Mayor Higgins, Josiah Trent, and Deputy William Dalton sat around a poker table, a solitary kerosene lamp illuminating the rough leather sack of gold Gideon had left behind. Josiah reached out with a trembling, manicured hand, picking up a nugget the size of a robin's egg. He held it to the light. "This isn't river dust," Josiah whispered, his eyes wide with avarice. "This is raw, unrefined vein gold. It's pure. There hasn't been a strike like this in Colorado since the Pikes Peak rush." William Dalton leaned back, striking a match against the sole of his boot and lighting a cheroot. "The mountain ghost has been sitting on a motherlode up there, and he just bought a penniless girl with a fraction of it." Dalton exhaled a thick cloud of smoke. "But here's the rub, Josiah. The Hastings deed for the river property. Did Higgins finalize the transfer?" The mayor wiped sweat from his forehead. "The terms of the debt court required a marriage. The savage just threw the gold and took the girl. No papers were signed. Technically, the bank still owns the deed, and the girl was abducted." A slow, wicked smile spread across Josiah Trent's face. "Abducted. By an outlaw. A tragedy." He leaned forward, tapping the gold nugget on the table. "William, if you were to form a posse to rescue poor, kidnapped Cordelia Hastings, and if the savage happened to resist arrest, the town would be rid of a menace. And we would find the source of this gold. Not to mention, the river property would be free to be auctioned to the highest bidder, namely, me." Dalton's eyes gleamed. "The snow will keep us trapped in the valley for a few weeks. But the second the spring thaw hits the lower pass, I'll send a wire to Denver. I know a few men who specialize in removing obstacles. We'll go up there, put a bullet in the ghost, take the gold, and I'll take the girl. She rejected me once. She won't have the luxury of doing it again." The deep winter months at the timberline did not bring the misery Cordelia had expected. Instead, they brought a profound, isolating peace. Cut off from the cruelty of Dead Man's Gulch, the fortress in the rock became a sanctuary, Cordelia quickly realized that the rumors of Gideon Hayes were nothing but the terrified fabrications of lesser men. He was not a savage. He was a man of intense discipline and surprising intellect. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were deliberate and grounded. During the howling blizzards that kept them trapped indoors for days on end, Gideon taught Ben how to whittle intricate animals from soft pine, his massive, scarred hands moving with incredible delicacy. He showed Lily how to read the tracks of snowshoe hares and foxes from the frosted window panes. For Cordelia, the dynamic was unnerving in its gentleness. She had prepared herself to be a servant, a purchased wife bound to the grim duties of the frontier. Yet, Gideon never laid a hand on her. He never demanded her submission. They fell into a natural rhythm of survival. She managed the hearth, the cooking, and the mending. He hunted, chopped wood, and maintained the impenetrable perimeter of their mountain home. One evening in late March, as the winds finally began to lose their jagged edge, Cordelia was dusting the bookshelves carved into the rock face. She pulled down a heavy, leather-bound journal. It slipped from her hands, landing open on the braided rug. As she knelt to pick it up, her eyes caught the precise, elegant handwriting inside. It was a topographical ledger, filled with intricate maps of the San Juan mountain range, detailed geological surveys, and complex mathematical equations calculating ore deposits. At the top of the page, stamped in faded black ink, was an official seal, United States Hayden Geological Survey, 1874, Chief Topographer, Captain Gideon Hayes. "You are a scientist," Cordelia breathed, looking up. Gideon was sitting by the fire, sharpening his bowie knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic shh paused. He looked at the ledger, a shadow passing over his silver eyes. "I was a cartographer for the government," Gideon said quietly, setting the knife down. "We were tasked with mapping the high country, looking for routes for the Denver and Rio Grande Railway, and looking for resources. Gold," Cordelia realized, her mind racing. "You found the vein," Gideon nodded slowly. "I found a massive, untouched hydrothermal vein of pure gold inside a cavern system higher up the peak. But I also found something else. The valley below that cavern is a sacred wintering ground for the Ute tribe. It's a place of peace. If I reported the strike to Washington, or to the syndicates in Denver, thousands of miners would have swarmed this mountain. They would have slaughtered the Ute, poisoned the water, and ripped the mountain to pieces, just like they did to Dead Man's Gulch." He stood, walking over to the window and looking out at the moonlit, snow-covered peaks. "I falsified the survey reports. I claimed the upper peaks were barren granite and impassable ice. I resigned my commission, bought my supplies, and came back up here to make sure no prospector ever stumbled upon it. I became the mountain ghost, to keep the greedy, violent men out." Cordelia stood up, walking slowly toward him. The fear she had once felt was entirely gone, replaced by an overwhelming, breathless admiration. "You sacrificed your career, your life in civilization, to protect people you didn't even know, to protect the mountain." Gideon turned his head, his gaze locking onto hers. The intensity in his eyes was staggering. Civilization is just a word men use to justify taking what isn't theirs. "I found more truth in the ice than I ever did in a parlor room." He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking, the air growing thick with an unspoken, electric tension. "And I found out what kind of men live in that valley when I watched them destroy your father." Cordelia's breath caught. You knew my father?" "I knew of him," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. "But I watched you, Cordelia, for 6 months. Every time I came down to the trading post, I saw you. I saw you holding your family together while the town spat on you. I saw your pride, your strength. I didn't buy you at that saloon to own you." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. Cordelia's eyes fluttered shut at the warmth of his touch, a sudden fierce heat blossoming in her chest. "I bought you," Gideon whispered, his thumb brushing her lower lip, "because I could not endure another day knowing you were trapped in a world that did not deserve you. Because I wanted you here, with me." Cordelia opened her eyes, looking up into the rugged, handsome face of the mountain man. All the rejections, The humiliation, the sheer terror of her past washed away in the silver light of his gaze. She leaned into his palm, her own hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the heavy, steady, powerful beat of his heart. He leaned down, and for the first time in her life, Cordelia understood what it meant to be truly desired. His lips met hers not with the savage force she had once feared, but with a deep, consuming reverence. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke, survival, and an unbreakable wild devotion. Cordelia wrapped her arms around his thick neck, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the storm. Their embrace was shattered by a low, guttural snarl. Gideon pulled back instantly, his hand flying to the heavy revolver at his hip. In the corner of the room, Kodiak Gideon's massive Timberwolf companion was pacing aggressively by the reinforced door, the hackles on his back raised stiff as wire. The beast let out a deep, echoing bark, pawing at the floorboards. Gideon moved to the window, seamlessly shifting from a tender lover to a lethal predator. He unlatched the heavy wooden shutter just a fraction of an inch and peered out into the moonlit expanse of the timberline. The spring thaw had begun to melt the lower passes, turning the snow to treacherous slush, but it was clear enough for men to climb. "Get the children," Gideon ordered, his voice devoid of all warmth, replaced by a chilling, absolute calm. "Put them in the root cellar beneath the floorboards. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." "Gideon, what is it?" Cordelia asked, panic spiking in her veins as she rushed to wake Ben and Lily. "Your past," Gideon said grimly, pulling his heavy Sharps rifle from the wall and checking the breech. Through the narrow slit in the window, he could see them. A mile down the ridge, moving slowly through the tree line, were the flickering orange lights of pitch torches. There were at least a dozen men, heavily armed. At the front of the pack, visible through Gideon's brass spyglass, was Deputy William Dalton. Beside him rode a man Gideon recognized from his military days, Silas Blackwood Reed, a notorious gun-for-hire who specialized in wiping out homesteaders for the railroad syndicates. Josiah Trent had not just sent a rescue party, he had sent an execution squad. Gideon strapped a bandolier of heavy-caliber ammunition across his chest. He looked back at Cordelia, who was lowering a terrified Lily into the hidden cellar space beneath the rug. Cordelia looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, not for herself, but for the man she had just realized she loved. "There are too many of them, Gideon," she whispered, her hands gripping the edge of the floorboards. "Dalton will kill you." Gideon Hayes walked over to her. He knelt, pressing a brief, fierce kiss to her forehead. When he pulled back, the silver in his eyes had hardened into chips of glacial ice. The mountain ghost had been awakened. "They brought guns to a mountain, Cordelia," Gideon said, his voice a low, terrifying promise of violence. "I am going to bring them the mountain." He pulled his heavy bear-hide coat over his shoulders, unbolted the timber door, and vanished into the freezing, violent dark, leaving Cordelia in the deafening silence of the approaching war. The temperature dropped drastically as the midnight hour approached, turning the falling slush into jagged, blinding shards of ice. Gideon Hayes did not walk down the established trail. He moved like a shadow along the sheer, impassable granite ridges that flanked the canyon. He knew every crevasse, every blind drop, and every echo in this valley. He had mapped it for the United States government, and he had guarded it with his life. A mile below, the posse of 13 men trudged through waist-deep snow. Deputy William Dalton was already shivering violently, cursing the wind and the freezing moisture seeping into his leather boots. Beside him, Silas Blackwood Reed rode a massive roan gelding, his face entirely unreadable beneath the brim of a dark Stetson. Reed was a former operative for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, dishonorably discharged in Chicago for his sadistic methods. He was a man who hunted humans for sport, and Josiah Trent had paid him a small fortune to ensure the mountain ghost never saw the spring. "The tracks end here at the ravine, Silas," Dalton called out over the howling wind, his teeth chattering. He held up a flickering pitch torch, illuminating a solid wall of ice and rock. "There's no way up. The savage must have a hidden winch or a rope ladder." Silas Reed spat a stream of black tobacco into the pristine snow. He dismounted, pulling a heavy Winchester .73 lever-action rifle from his saddle scabbard. "Men who live in the clouds always leave a back door, deputy." Spread the men out. Keep your torches high. If it moves in the dark, you fill it with lead. High above them, perched on an outcropping of black basalt, Gideon rested the heavy octagonal barrel of his Sharps buffalo rifle on a bed of packed snow. He adjusted the rear vernier sight, calculating the wind drift and the extreme downward angle. He didn't aim for a man. He aimed for the psychological linchpin of their courage. Gideon exhaled, his breath pluming in the freezing air, and pulled the set trigger. The boom of the 50 to 90 caliber rifle was deafening, a localized clap of thunder that rolled violently down the canyon walls. Down in the ravine, the pitch torch in Deputy Dalton's hand exploded into a shower of splinters and burning resin. The sheer concussive force of the massive bullet passing within inches of Dalton's face sent the deputy sprawling backward into the snowbank, screaming in blind terror. Panic instantly infected the hired guns. Several of them raised their standard-issue Springfield Model 1873 rifles and fired blindly into the pitch-black canopy of the cliffs, their muzzle flashes illuminating nothing but falling snow. "Hold your fire, you undisciplined fools," Reed bellowed, dropping to one knee behind his horse. "He's firing from elevation. Douse the torches. You're painting targets on your own chests." As the men scrambled to throw their torches into the snow, plunging the ravine into absolute terrifying darkness, a new sound cut through the wind. It was a low, guttural, vibrating snarl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, a massive gray shape detached itself from the shadows of the tree line. Kodiak, the timber wolf, moved with lethal, silent speed. He didn't attack to kill, he attacked to break the line. The wolf's jaws snapped onto the ankle of a trailing hired gun, dragging the screaming man into the heavy brush before vanishing back into the dark. "Ghost!" another man shrieked, firing his revolver into the empty woods. "It's a demon, Reed. I ain't dying for no town banker's gold." Two men turned and began frantically slogging back down the trail toward Dead Man's Gulch. Gideon racked another massive cartridge into the Sharps. He fired again, this time shattering the thick branch of a dead ponderosa pine directly above the fleeing men. The heavy timber crashed down, blocking their retreat and sending them scrambling into the freezing mud. Gideon slung the rifle over his back and began his descent. He moved with terrifying verticality, sliding down scree slopes and dropping between boulders like a hunting cat. He was dismantling them without slaughtering them, using the hostility of the San Juans to break their minds. Silas Reed, however, was not a man easily broken. The former Pinkerton agent abandoned his panicked men, drawing a pair of silver-plated Colt single-action Army revolvers. He moved silently up the left flank of the ravine, using the screams of his own men as cover. He spotted a massive, fur-clad silhouette moving through the timber ahead. "I tracked the James Younger boys through Missouri haze," Reed called out into the dark, his voice a calm, chilling sneer. "You're just a hermit in a bear coat. You bleed like any other man." Reed rounded a massive boulder, raising his Colts, his finger pulling back the hammer. But the silhouette he had been tracking wasn't Gideon. It was Gideon's heavy bear-hide coat, draped over the branches of a scrub oak. Before Reed could process the decoy, a massive hand materialized from the darkness above him. Gideon dropped from a granite ledge directly onto the bounty hunter. The impact drove Reed face first into the frozen earth. Reed thrashed violently, managing to fire one wild shot into the air, but Gideon's scarred, calloused hand clamped around Reed's wrist, applying a sickening, immense pressure until the bones cracked. Reed howled in agony, the Colt slipping from his paralyzed fingers. Gideon hauled the mercenary to his feet by the collar of his coat, slamming him back against the rock wall. The silver in Gideon's eyes was terrifying to behold up close. It was the look of a man who possessed the capacity for ultimate violence, yet exercised supreme control. "You hunted men in the plains, Pinkerton," Gideon whispered, his voice a gravelly rumble that vibrated in Reed's chest. "This is not the plains. This is my house, and you are trespassing." Gideon stripped Reed of his remaining weapons and tossed him brutally into a snowdrift. "Walk back to Denver, Reed. If I ever see your shadow in this territory again, I won't use a decoy." Gideon turned and walked purposefully toward the center of the ravine, where Deputy Dalton was frantically trying to reload a frozen revolver with numb, shaking fingers. When Dalton looked up and saw the towering, buckskin-clad giant stepping out of the swirling snow, the deputy fell to his knees, dropping his gun entirely. "Please," Dalton begged, tears of terror freezing on his cheeks. "Josiah Trent put me up to it. He wants the girl's deed. He wants the gold. I was just following orders. Hayes, I swear to God." Gideon looked down at the man who had publicly humiliated Cordelia, the man who had sneered at her desperation. He felt the cold urge to end the deputy's life right there in the snow. But he remembered Cordelia's face, her gentleness, and the warmth she had brought to his freezing world. "You tell Josiah Trent," Gideon said, his voice echoing over the moans of the defeated posse, "that the Hastings debt is paid. The river acreage is spoken for, and if any man from Dead Man's Gulch sets foot above the timberline again, the mountain will not be so merciful." Gideon turned his back on the cowering deputy and walked away, disappearing into the blinding white vortex of the storm, leaving the broken posse to the mercy of the freezing night. When Gideon finally returned to the fortress in the rock, the sun was beginning to bleed over the jagged eastern peaks, painting the snow in hues of pale pink and gold. He pushed open the heavy timber door, exhausted, his buckskin shirt torn and his knuckles bruised. Cordelia was awake, standing barefoot by the roaring hearth. When she saw him, she didn't ask about the gunfire that had echoed faintly up the canyon. She didn't ask if he was a murderer. She simply ran across the floorboards, throwing her arms around his waist and burying her face in his chest. Gideon's massive arms enveloped her, burying his face in her dark hair. He closed his eyes, the residual violence of the night draining away, replaced by an overwhelming, anchoring peace. "They are gone," he murmured into her hair. "They will not come back." For the next 2 months, the mountain fortress remained their private world. The harsh winter slowly gave way to the brilliant, explosive bloom of the alpine spring. The snow melted into rushing, crystalline waterfalls. Ben and Lily played outside in the fields of wild blue columbine, their cheeks flushed with health and laughter, guarded diligently by Kodiak. In those sunlit weeks, the bond between Cordelia and Gideon forged into an unbreakable steel. They were no longer a purchased bride and a fearsome outcast. They were absolute equals, bound by survival, profound respect, and a quiet, all-consuming love. But the real world below still demanded a reckoning. In late May, when the lower pass was completely clear of mud, a finely appointed Concord stagecoach rolled into Dead Man's Gulch. It did not carry prospectors or gamblers. It carried the official seal of the governor of Colorado, John L. Root. Inside the Silver Pines saloon, Josiah Trent was holding court, smoking an imported cigar. He had spent the last 2 months spinning the narrative of the disastrous winter expedition, claiming the mountain ghost had cowardly ambushed the posse and likely murdered Cordelia Hastings in cold blood. He had already drawn up the papers to claim the river acreage as abandoned property. The saloon doors opened, not with the violent crash of a blizzard, but with the steady, measured squeak of well-oiled hinges. The piano player stopped dead. The whiskey glasses froze mid-air. Standing in the doorway was Cordelia Hastings. She was no longer the freezing, desperate girl in a threadbare calico dress begging for scraps. She wore a tailored riding habit of deep emerald green velvet, her posture immaculate, her chin held high with a regal, untouchable grace. Beside her stood Gideon Hayes. Without his massive bear hide, he was dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored black broadcloth suit, though he still wore his worn leather boots and the heavy Bowie knife at his belt. He looked every inch a man of dangerous wealth and undeniable authority. Flanking them were 2 armed United States federal marshals. Josiah Trent's cigar fell from his lips, bouncing off his silk vest and onto the floor. "Cordelia," he stammered, his face draining of all blood. You're alive. We thought the savage." "Mr. Trent," Cordelia interrupted, her voice ringing out clear and cold, silencing the entire room. "You thought you could steal my family's legacy. You thought you could send murderers into the mountains to silence a man who stood in the way of your greed." One of the federal marshals stepped forward, unfurling a heavy parchment document bearing the golden seal of the state of Colorado. By order of Governor John L. Root in the Federal Land Office, the marshal announced to the stunned crowd. The property formerly known as the Hastings River Acreage has been officially patented and transferred into an irrevocable trust. The trust is fully funded by Captain Gideon Hayes, formerly of the United States Geological Survey, and the sole beneficiary is his legal wife, Mrs. Cordelia Hayes. A collective gasp echoed through the saloon. Cordelia looked at the men who had scorned her. She looked at Ezra Cobb, who stared at the floor in shame. She looked at Nathaniel Briggs, whose jaw was slack with shock. She looked at Samuel Weston, who quickly looked away. 7 men, 7 cowards who had looked at a drowning woman and refused to throw a rope because it might tarnish their reputations. And then she looked up at Gideon, the man who had walked through a blizzard, thrown a fortune at her feet, and fought a small army to keep her safe. Josiah Trent scrambled backward. "This is absurd. My father's syndicate holds the original debts. You can't bypass local jurisdiction." The second marshal stepped forward, producing a pair of heavy iron shackles. "Mr. Trent, we also have sworn affidavits from Silas Reed and William Dalton, currently resting in a Denver penitentiary, detailing your conspiracy to commit murder for hire and land fraud. You are under federal arrest." The town watched in absolute paralyzed silence as Josiah Trent, the wealthiest man in Dead Man's Gulch, was dragged out of the saloon in chains, weeping and pleading for leniency. Mayor Higgins, realizing his own complicity would soon be uncovered, quietly slipped out the back door, abandoning his office entirely. Justice had not come from the town's corrupt laws. It had come from the high peaks. Cordelia turned to leave, her arm looped securely through Gideon's. She didn't offer the town a speech or a gloating smile. They simply did not matter anymore. They were ghosts of a painful past, fading rapidly in the light of her new reality. As they walked out onto the wooden boardwalk, the warm spring sun washing over them, Gideon looked down at her, that familiar, gentle silver light in his eyes. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked quietly. Cordelia smiled, a brilliant, unrestrained expression of pure joy. "I am already there, Gideon. I am already there." The saga of Cordelia Hastings became a frontier legend, a testament to the fact that salvation often arrives in the most terrifying of forms. She had endured the ultimate public humiliation, rejected by 7 men who valued society's shallow judgments over human life. Yet those 7 rejections were not a curse. They were the necessary, painful steps that led her away from a town built on cowardice and straight into the arms of the only man strong enough to weather her storm. Gideon Hayes was perceived as a beast by weak men, but to Cordelia, he was the shield that protected her family and the foundation upon which she built an empire. Together, they transformed the disputed river acreage into the most prosperous, independent ranch in Colorado, a sanctuary where the mountain ghost and his fiercely devoted wife ruled their wild, beautiful world, forever untouched by the judgment of lesser men.